200 people, one ceremony, and two chairs in the front row that sat empty when it mattered most. Not because of an accident, not because of an emergency, but because my parents had made a decision. A deliberate, calculated, public decision to humiliate me on my wedding day. I couldn't believe it when it was happening, and yet some part of me had always known it was coming. Because when you grow up being the daughter who is told she doesn't need as much, you spend your whole life waiting for the moment the truth finally says it out loud. What happened on October 14th in Asheville, North Carolina wasn't just a family drama. It was the exposure of a betrayal so deep, so financially calculated, so coldly executed, that by the end of that night, the shocking truth had spread to every phone in the room, and then to thousands more. My name is Raylan Harlan. I was 31 years old, and I had been cheated, lied to, and backstabbed by the people who were supposed to love me most, not just emotionally, but legally. Because while I was planning my wedding, someone I trusted was quietly stealing from me. Here's what they didn't know. I was about to marry a financial analyst, and at 8:47 p.m., in front of everyone we had ever invited to witness our beginning, the truth walked into the room with a PowerPoint presentation and sat down at the center of it all. What happened next didn't just change my life, it changed theirs. And by the time the night was over, the family that had spent years making me feel shamed and small had become the ones standing in the rubble of their own choices. This is not a story about revenge for the sake of it. This is a story about justice, the kind you have to fight for, document, and sometimes expose in public because private conversations were never going to be enough. It's about reclaiming your self-worth when the people who were supposed to protect it spent years using it as a bargaining chip. And it's about what happens when you finally, stop being afraid of the truth and let it speak for itself. Stay with me. Because the details of what my parents did, what my husband found, and what justice actually looked like when it arrived, none of it is what you're expecting. There I was, standing in the doorway of the most beautiful venue I'd ever seen, wearing the dress I'd dreamed about since I was a little girl. And I couldn't believe what I was looking at. 2 chairs, front row, empty, not misplaced, not forgotten, deliberately, coldly empty. They weren't stuck in traffic. They weren't lost. They had made a choice. And that choice was to humiliate me on the one day a daughter is supposed to feel like she matters most in the world. I'd been shamed before, quietly in kitchens and phone calls and passive-aggressive holiday dinners, but never like this. Never in front of 200 people who all turned their heads at the same moment and saw exactly what I saw. A family betrayal on full display. The backstabbing wasn't just personal anymore. It was a statement. A public one. And every single guest in that room understood it without a single word being spoken. My name is Raylan Harlan, and I was 31 years old the day my parents decided my wedding wasn't worth showing up for. Not because of an emergency, not because of illness, but because my sister Vanessa had booked a luxury wellness retreat in Costa Rica, and my parents decided her vacation was more important than my vows. The injustice of it hit me like a wall, and the humiliation burned in my chest like something I had never felt before. I kept walking down that aisle. I kept my chin up. I kept my eyes on Daniel, the man I was about to marry, standing at the altar with tears in his eyes, not from joy alone, but because he knew. He knew what those empty chairs meant. And he knew what I had sacrificed just to get to this moment. That look on his face gave me more strength than anything my family had ever offered me, and I needed every bit of it for what was coming. What happened next, later that same night, at exactly 8:47 p.m., changed everything. Not just for me, but for my parents, for Vanessa, and for every single person sitting in that room. Because what Daniel had found in the days before our wedding wasn't just shocking. It was the kind of truth that doesn't stay quiet for long. Let me take you back, because the story doesn't start with empty chairs. It starts with a promise. About 18 months before the wedding, Daniel got down on one knee at a little rooftop restaurant in Portland, Oregon, with the city lights behind him and a ring that made me cry before he even finished the sentence. I said yes so fast he laughed, and for the first time in a long time, I actually felt like my life was beginning. What I didn't know was that someone was already planning to unravel it. My parents called the next morning, warm, almost unusually warm, and my mother said something that I still replay in my head. "Raylan, we are so happy for you, sweetheart. We want to be part of this." I should have noticed the careful wording. Not, "We're proud of you." Not, "We love Daniel." Just, "We want to be part of this." Looking back, I now understand that being part of it meant something very different to them than it did to me. A few weeks after the engagement, the attorney who had handled my grandparents' estate reached out to remind us that a trust had been set up years ago, $105,000, designated for my wedding and the start of my married life. My grandparents on my mother's side had set it aside before they passed, with my name on it, as a gift for my future. I cried when I heard the number. Not because of what it could buy, but because it felt like my grandparents were still watching over me, still choosing me. That feeling of being chosen, I'd been starved of it my whole life. My parents seemed supportive during those early planning months. My mother came dress shopping. My father offered to help with vendor calls. I genuinely believed that this milestone had finally made them see me differently. I let my guard down. I let myself trust them. And I poured every bit of my self-worth into building something beautiful. Something that would finally prove I was just as worthy of celebration as anyone else in my family. But even in those sweet early months, there were small moments. A comment here, a hesitation there, that I brushed away like crumbs from a table. I didn't want to see the pattern. I wanted to believe in the version of my family that showed up for dress shopping. What I didn't know was that behind the smiles, something was already being set into motion. Something that had nothing to do with my wedding and everything to do with my sister. If you've never been the responsible one in a family that has a golden child, let me paint you a picture. Because the betrayal you feel isn't just about one moment. It's the accumulation of 1,000 small moments where you watched someone else get everything while you were handed a compliment instead. Raylan is so steady. Raylan can handle it. Raylan doesn't need as much. I heard those words so many times growing up that I started to believe them, and that was exactly the point. Vanessa is 3 years younger than me, and from the time she could walk, she was treated like the family's crown jewel. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it with the precision of someone who documented the pattern. Her college was fully funded. Mine came with a partial loan and a "we believe in your independence" speech. Her car was a graduation gift. I bought mine used with money from 2 part-time jobs. The dignity I had to fight for every single day of my 20s was handed to Vanessa like it was standard issue. My parents never saw it as favoritism, or at least they never admitted it. In their version of the story, Vanessa just needed more support, while I was built different. The infidelity wasn't romantic, it was emotional. They were emotionally unfaithful to the idea of fairness. They cheated me out of a level playing field for years, and dressed it up in language that made me feel ungrateful for noticing. And I swallowed it. Over and over again, I swallowed it. I lied to myself too. I have to be honest about that. I told myself it didn't matter, that I had built something real without their help, that I was stronger for it. And maybe I was. But strength built out of neglect carries a grief inside it that most people never talk about. I had self-worth, yes, but it was the kind I had stitched together myself in the dark, without anyone handing me the thread. I deserved better, and somewhere deep down, I always knew it. The hardest part about the golden child dynamic is that it makes you doubt your own perception. You start to wonder if you're imagining things, if you're being too sensitive, if maybe, just maybe, your sister really does need more and you really are fine. That doubt is a cage. And it was the same doubt my parents were counting on when, months before my wedding, they came to me with a demand so absurd I actually laughed the first time I heard it, until I realized they were completely serious. It was a Tuesday evening. I remember because I was reviewing catering contracts at the kitchen table, when my mother called with that particular tone of voice she uses when she's already decided something and just needs you to agree. She didn't ask, she informed me. Vanessa had booked a 14-day luxury wellness retreat at a high-end resort in Costa Rica, and the dates overlapped with my wedding weekend. Therefore, I needed to move my wedding date. That was it. No apology, no negotiation. Just move the date. I actually pulled the phone away from my face and stared at it for a second, because I genuinely thought I had misheard her. My wedding had been planned for over a year. The venue was booked, the vendors were contracted, our 200 guests had made travel arrangements, and my mother was telling me to dismantle all of that because Vanessa had chosen to book a vacation on the same weekend, a vacation she could have rescheduled with a phone call. The reckoning of this situation was already building, whether my parents knew it or not. When I said no, calmly, clearly, respectfully, the conversation flipped in an instant. Suddenly, I was being selfish. Suddenly, I was being disrespectful. Suddenly, this was about family unity and what Grandma and Grandpa would have wanted. They weaponized my grandparents' memory to guilt me into erasing my own wedding date, and I felt something in me go cold and sharp all at once. I had been lied to about what this family was for years, but this was the first time they said the quiet part out loud. My father called 2 days later and doubled down. If I didn't move the date, there would be consequences. He used that word, consequences. I was 31 years old, a grown woman, a professional, a partner, a person with her own life, and my father was threatening me like I was a teenager who'd broken curfew. The humiliation of that phone call wasn't loud. It was quiet and cold and deeply shameful. Not for me, for him. For what he revealed about how he actually saw me. I held my ground. I said the date was not changing. I said it with love, but I said it clearly. And then the silence began. The kind of silence that is its own form of punishment. I told Daniel that night, and he held me while I cried. Not because I was weak, but because I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what was happening. Neither of us knew yet that the silence was only the beginning, and that what was happening behind the scenes was far worse than being ignored. For 3 weeks after I refused to move the wedding date, my parents went completely silent. No calls, no texts, no response to my messages. But the silence wasn't private. It was performative. My mother was posting on social media every single day, photos of Vanessa at dress fittings, captions about supporting the ones you love, little heart emojis, and so proud of this girl, comments from family members who had no idea what was happening behind closed doors. I was being erased in real time while my sister was being elevated, and every notification felt like a small, precise knife. That kind of emotional punishment has a name. It's called the silent treatment as a control mechanism. And it works by making you feel so anxious to restore the relationship that you abandon your own position just to stop the pain. I felt it. I won't pretend I didn't. There were nights I almost picked up the phone and said, "Fine, I'll move the date, just to end the agony of being excluded." That's exactly what they were banking on. My parents had used this tactic my entire life, and they knew how much it cost me to be shut out. But something shifted about 2 weeks in. I started to get angry instead of sad. Not the reactive, explosive kind of angry, the clear, structural kind. The kind that makes you start writing things down. I began documenting every missed call, every unanswered message, every public post they made celebrating Vanessa while ignoring me. Daniel noticed the change in me and didn't try to soften it. Instead, he sat down beside me and said, "Keep everything, every single thing." He was a financial analyst by trade, but in that moment, he was thinking like someone who already suspected the situation was bigger than a family argument. I also started having honest conversations with my therapist, my closest friends, and one aunt on my father's side who had watched the family dynamic for decades and validated everything I was feeling. She used a word that hit me like a cold splash of water. She called it systemic. Not a bad week, not a rough patch. A systemic, lifelong pattern of using my dignity as a bargaining chip. And once you see a pattern that clearly, you can't unsee it. My reclaiming of my own peace had officially begun. What I didn't know, what neither Daniel nor I had fully connected yet, was that the silence wasn't just emotional retaliation. While my parents were ignoring my calls, they were making other calls. To other people. About my wedding. And when the truth about those calls surfaced just days before the ceremony, the word betrayal took on a whole new meaning. 4 days before the wedding, I got a call from our venue coordinator in Asheville, North Carolina. A woman named Patricia who had been nothing but professional and warm throughout the entire planning process. Her voice on that call was careful, measured, the way people speak when they're about to tell you something they know will hurt. She said there had been conflicting instructions coming from someone claiming to represent our family, and that she needed to confirm with me directly what the actual plan was. I felt the floor drop out from under me. Patricia walked me through it carefully. Over the span of 3 weeks, someone had called the venue 4 separate times. Twice trying to cancel the event entirely. Twice requesting a postponement to a date that had no connection to any plan Daniel and I had ever made. The person had identified herself as my mother. She had cited family circumstances. She had been persistent enough that Patricia had begun drafting cancellation paperwork before something made her pause and reach out to me directly. If she hadn't, I might have shown up to an empty venue on my wedding day. I sat in my car in a parking lot after that call, and I didn't cry. I think I was too shocked to cry. The exposure of what my mother had done crossed a line I hadn't even known to protect. This wasn't passive disappointment or emotional withdrawal. This was active sabotage. And later, we would understand exactly why they needed me overwhelmed, emotional, and distracted. If I was busy rescheduling a wedding, I wouldn't be auditing anything. That's when it stopped being family dysfunction and became a case. I called Daniel immediately. He was quiet on the phone for a long moment, and then he said, "Raylan, I need to show you something I found." He had been working on something separately, something financial, and now the 2 threads were beginning to pull toward the same knot. I asked him to wait until I got home. I needed to be sitting down for whatever came next. And when I walked through our front door 30 minutes later and saw his laptop open on the kitchen table with spreadsheets across the screen, I understood that what I thought was a family conflict had just become something else entirely. We stayed up until 2 a.m. that night going through everything together. By the time we were done, we both knew that my wedding wasn't just being boycotted out of pettiness. It was being sabotaged to keep me distracted. Distracted from a financial crime that had been committed against me in plain sight. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have anticipated, was that they had chosen to do this to a woman who was about to marry the one person in the world most qualified to find it. Daniel is methodical by nature. He's the kind of person who reads the fine print on everything, who keeps receipts organized by month, who notices when numbers don't add up before most people have even finished reading the page. When he first started looking into the trust fund again, after my parents began interfering with the wedding and something told him to pull every document we had, he wasn't looking for a crime. He was trying to reconcile why the disbursement paperwork had been so slow. What he found instead made him sit completely still for almost 10 minutes before he called me into the room. $73,000 had been withdrawn from the trust. Not by me, not by the attorney who handled my grandparents' estate, by my mother, who had been named a temporary co-trustee during a legal transition period following my grandfather's death, a role that was administrative, not discretionary. She didn't have the right to move those funds. She didn't have the authorization to redirect them, but the bank had treated her signature as sufficient during that transition period, and she had used that window carefully, spacing the withdrawals out, keeping each one small enough to look routine over 14 months, sending the money to an account my parents had long managed on Vanessa's behalf. I couldn't believe it. I said those words out loud. I actually said them to Daniel. I cannot believe this. Not because I couldn't believe my family was capable of betrayal. By that point, I had seen enough to believe almost anything. What I couldn't believe was the scale of it, the coldness of it, the precision of it. Someone had to think carefully to move that money the way it was moved. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't a mistake. This was a decision made with full knowledge that it was wrong, made by someone who assumed I would never look closely enough to find it. The truth was sitting in the bank records like it had always been, waiting for someone to pay attention. Infidelity of any kind, romantic, familial, financial, always leaves a paper trail, and this one was no different. Cheated out of funds that my grandparents had specifically designated for me. Lied to about the trust's status when I'd asked about it months earlier. The shocking part wasn't just that it happened, it was that they had continued to interact with me, to attend my dress fittings, to post about family online, while knowing exactly what they had done. Daniel printed everything that night. Every transaction record, every wire confirmation, every document that showed the trust clause and the unauthorized withdrawal side by side. All of it certified and obtained immediately once Daniel contacted the estate attorney directly and explained what he had found. He built a file, a complete, organized, legally presentable file. And then he said something to me that I will never forget for as long as I live. He said, "They wanted to humiliate you at your wedding. Let's make sure that when they do, they don't realize what's waiting for them on the other side of it." I looked at him across that kitchen table, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something that wasn't grief. It was accountability, the quiet, inevitable kind, beginning to take its shape. The morning of the wedding was genuinely beautiful. Asheville in October is something out of a painting. Golden light, the mountains soft in the distance, the air carrying that specific chill that makes everything feel cinematic. My bridesmaids were with me. My aunt was crying happy tears before we even left the hotel, and I had made peace, or something close to it, with the fact that my parents might not come. I told myself I was prepared. I told myself I had let go. But the moment I stepped into that venue and saw those 2 front-row seats still empty when the music began, I understood that preparing for something and living it are 2 entirely different things. The ceremony began. The music played. I walked down the aisle alone, which I had decided to do with intention, as a statement about who I was and how I had always moved through this life. And I kept my eyes on Daniel, who was standing at the altar looking at me like I was the only solid thing in the room. The guests were quiet and respectful. The officiant began. And for about 12 minutes, I actually believed we were going to have a peaceful ceremony. Then I heard the sound of chairs scraping against the floor. My parents had arrived late by design. Not because of traffic, not because of any genuine obstacle, but because the timing was calculated. They walked in during the ceremony, already drawing eyes, already pulling the room's attention. They sat down in those 2 front-row chairs. And then, just as the officiant reached the midpoint of the reading, my father stood up. Slowly, deliberately. My mother followed. And my father said, loudly enough for the first several rows to hear clearly, "This is the lesson you get for choosing yourself over your family." The room went completely still, the kind of still that happens when a social contract is broken in public and everyone present is trying to process what they just witnessed. Several guests near the front turned to look at each other. One of my bridesmaids grabbed my hand from behind. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he did not look away from me, not for a single second. My parents walked out. The door clicked shut behind them, and the ceremony continued, because I decided in that moment that they had already taken enough from me and they were not taking this. I finished my vows with a steady voice. I do not know how. I think the body sometimes carries you through things that the mind cannot fully hold. When Daniel and I were pronounced married, the applause that came from those 200 people felt like something more than celebration. It felt like witnessing. Like every person in that room had just decided collectively whose side they were on. What they didn't know yet was that the evening was far from over, and that the moment my parents thought was their victory was actually the beginning of their unraveling. The reception was held in a glass-walled hall overlooking the mountains, and by the time guests arrived, the atmosphere had shifted into something charged. People were still processing what had happened at the ceremony, talking in small clusters, the energy somewhere between celebration and unease. Daniel and I had talked about it during the 20-minute window between the ceremony and the reception. I had asked him once, "Are we doing this?" He had looked at me with absolute calm and said, "You've earned this." And that was enough. About 40 minutes into the reception, after dinner had been served and the first toasts were done, Daniel took the microphone. He thanked everyone for being there. He said a few warm words about the day. And then he said quietly and clearly that he wanted to share something. Not out of anger, but because the people in that room deserved to know the truth about what they had witnessed and about what had been done. You could have heard a pin drop. Every face in that room turned toward the screen behind him as the projector came to life. What appeared on that screen was not a slideshow of wedding photos. It was a PowerPoint presentation, clean, professional, organized, that Daniel had built over the previous 72 hours. It began with the trust document, my grandfather's original clause, my name as the sole beneficiary, the co-trustee terms that clearly limited my mother's administrative role. Then came the bank records, the $73,000 in unauthorized withdrawals, the account they were sent to, the dates, the amounts. Every single transaction displayed with the kind of clarity that makes denial physically impossible. And when that first slide hit the screen, the room began to realize those empty chairs at the ceremony weren't the betrayal. They were just the cover. Then came the venue coordination emails, 4 separate attempts by my mother to cancel or postpone my wedding behind my back, printed and time-stamped and presented without commentary. Then came the social media posts, my mother celebrating Vanessa publicly during the exact weeks she was refusing to answer my calls. Then came the documentation of the wellness retreat costs, paid for, in part, with funds that legally belonged to me. The room was completely silent the entire time Daniel spoke. Not an uncomfortable silence, a witnessing silence. The reckoning that had been building for 18 months was finally arriving, and every person in that room could feel it. When Daniel finished, he set down the microphone, walked over to me, and took my hand. And the room erupted. Not everyone. Some people sat in stunned stillness. Some quietly gathered their things and left, and I understood that too. But the majority of those 200 people stood up. The applause wasn't performative. It was the sound of people who had watched an injustice happen in real time and were now watching the truth reclaim the room. My restoration had become something public, something witnessed, something that could not be taken back. By the time we left for our hotel that night, the video had already started spreading. One of the guests, I still don't know who, had recorded part of Daniel's presentation on their phone, and by midnight it had been shared across 3 different social platforms. By the next morning, it had already been seen by thousands, and climbing. The comments were overwhelming. People who had never met me, who had no personal stake in the story, were saying things that I had needed to hear my entire life. She deserved better. This is financial abuse. The family is disgusting. The internet, for once, was unanimously on my side. The fallout for my parents was swift and, I have to be honest, more significant than I had anticipated. My father owns a mid-sized landscaping company in Asheville, and my mother is a real estate agent. Both businesses that depend almost entirely on local reputation and word of mouth. In the days that followed the video spreading, my father's business reviews began changing. Former clients who had seen the video, or who knew someone who had, left detailed comments about integrity and trust. My mother's real estate profile took a similar hit. The backstabbing they had committed against me had now become a matter of public record, and the business community does not separate personal character from professional accountability. Family members began reaching out, some in support of me, some in damage control on behalf of my parents, some just trying to understand what had happened. My mother sent a text message that was equal parts defensive and threatening. She called the reception a public attack and suggested Daniel had manipulated the documents. What she didn't seem to understand, or refuse to accept, was that documents don't manipulate. Numbers don't lie. Timestamps don't change based on how you feel about them. The truth had been put in front of 200 witnesses and recorded on camera, and no amount of reframing was going to change what those records showed. The most striking moment of that fallout came from Vanessa herself, who called me 2 days after the wedding with a voice I'd never heard from her before, small, almost frightened, and said, "I didn't know where the money came from, Raylan. I swear I didn't ask for it." And I believed her. I actually believed her, not because I'm naive, but because my parents had always managed her finances. She had never had independent access to that account, and they had kept her deliberately uninformed so she could remain blameless. Vanessa was a beneficiary of our parents' choices, not the architect of them. That distinction mattered to me, even then. The story had taken on a life of its own, and while I hadn't intended for it to go public, I also wasn't going to apologize for the truth spreading. My dignity was not negotiable. My reclaiming wasn't a performance. It was a necessity. And what came next, in the form of legal action, was simply the natural continuation of a process that had started the moment Daniel said, "Keep everything." Within a week of the wedding, we had our first meeting with a trust litigation attorney in Asheville, a woman named Diane Forsyth, who had been recommended by Daniel's colleague and who, when she reviewed the documentation, said something that gave me chills. "This is one of the cleaner cases of unauthorized trust disbursement I've seen in 15 years. Clean, in legal terms, means well-documented, clearly defined, and difficult to contest. It meant Daniel's meticulous record-keeping had done more than expose a betrayal. It had built a case." Diane filed suit within 2 weeks. The legal process moved faster than I expected, partly because the documentation was so thorough and partly because, when faced with a formal complaint, my parents' attorney advised them not to fight it, because he knew exactly what a judge would do with those records. Mediation was ordered. I sat across a table from my mother and my father for the first time since my wedding day, and it was one of the strangest experiences of my life. They looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, but in every other way. The authority they had held over me for 31 years had evaporated the moment they were sitting across from a neutral mediator with a folder of their own misdeeds in front of them. The settlement terms were clear. Full restoration of the $73,000 to a new trust account in my name, plus an additional $18,000 in damages for the costs and distress caused by the sabotage attempts on the venue. But the part that mattered most to me, more than any dollar amount, was a clause that Diane had pushed for, and my parents had ultimately agreed to: a written, signed, notarized acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Not a vague, "we're sorry if feelings were hurt." A specific, documented admission that they had acted outside their legal authority and caused harm. The justice I had been denied my whole life had just been put in writing. I cried in Diane's office after the mediation concluded. Not from sadness, from the particular relief that comes when something you've been carrying alone for years is finally held by something larger than your own grief. The system, flawed as it so often is, had worked. The truth had been documented, witnessed, contested, and ultimately vindicated. My self-worth wasn't something I had to argue for anymore. It had been validated by a legal process and a signed piece of paper that no one could take back. What struck me most in the days that followed was how quiet everything became. The texts stopped. The social media games stopped. The manipulation and the guilt trips and the silent treatments, all of it stopped, because the only tool my parents had ever used against me was control, and control only works when the other person has something to lose. I had stopped being afraid of losing them the moment I realized they had never truly been there to be lost. Over the next 3 months, Daniel and I closed on a house. A real house. Not an apartment we were outgrowing, not a rental where we felt temporary, but a home with a yard and a guest room and a kitchen where I stood on the first morning and cried because it felt like proof. Proof that everything we had fought for, documented, and refused to surrender had converted into something real and lasting. The settlement funds gave us the foundation we needed to move forward without the shadow of debt or dependency, and we had built that foundation with our own hands. I was also 3 months pregnant by the time we signed the closing documents. We found out on a Tuesday in our old apartment with a test stick on the bathroom counter and Daniel kneeling in the hallway because he couldn't stand up straight from the emotion of it. We hadn't planned the timing, but we also couldn't have designed a better one. New home, new chapter, new life literally beginning. I sat with that reality for a long time and thought about the kind of family I wanted to build, and the kind I was determined never to recreate. With Diane's guidance, Daniel and I set up a new trust. This one structured specifically to protect our child, with legal safeguards that made it impossible for a co-trustee to move funds without dual authorization and documentation. My grandparents had tried to give me a gift, and that gift had been taken. I was going to make sure that what we built for our child could not be taken from them the same way. The legal protections weren't paranoia. They were wisdom, earned the hard way. I also established clear boundaries with my family, not with anger, but with legal precision. My parents were informed through our attorney that any future contact attempts that involved financial matters, harassment, or pressure would be responded to formally. They were not banned from my life. That was their choice to make, not mine. But they were no longer granted the informal access that had made their manipulation possible. The reclaiming of my own boundaries was the quietest and most important victory of everything that had happened. What I want you to understand is that restoration isn't just financial, and it isn't just structural. It's the daily experience of waking up in a life that belongs to you, of making decisions without bracing for punishment, of loving someone without also managing them. Daniel and I had built that life not despite everything that had been done to us, but partly because of it, because the fire had burned away everything that wasn't real, and what was left was ours completely. Here's what I want to leave you with, because I didn't go through all of this just to have a good story. I went through it to understand something that took me 31 years to learn, and I want to hand it to you right now so you don't have to wait that long. When family uses money and guilt as control mechanisms, they are not acting from love. They are acting from a need for power. And the difference between those two things is everything. The betrayal I experienced wasn't just about a trust fund or a wedding date or empty chairs in a front row. It was about a lifelong pattern of being told that my needs were negotiable while someone else's were sacred. The backstabbing, the financial crime, the sabotage, those were just the moment when the pattern became too obvious to ignore anymore. If you are living inside a pattern like that right now, I want you to hear this. The clarity you're looking for isn't going to come from them. It's going to come from you choosing to stop waiting for people who have never seen you clearly to suddenly start. Document everything. I mean this practically and urgently. Keep records of financial agreements. Understand any legal documents with your name on them. Don't assume someone else is managing them honestly on your behalf. If something feels wrong, ask questions and get independent counsel. The truth that came for me came not because I was brave and dramatic at a reception. It came because Daniel and I had a paper trail that was impossible to dispute. Karma is real, but karma works a lot faster when it's backed by evidence. The family you build, the one you choose, the one you create, the one you grow with intention, can be more solid and more nourishing than the one you were born into. That is not a betrayal of your origins. That is the most honest thing I know about surviving them. My son or daughter will grow up in a home where love is not weaponized, where support is not conditional, and where their dignity is treated as non-negotiable from the very first day. That is my real vengeance. Not the PowerPoint, not the lawsuit, not the settlement. It's the life I'm living right now. If you take nothing else from my story, take this. You are not required to keep accepting less than you deserve from people simply because they share your last name. The shamed and the humiliated and the backstabbed and the cheated, we do not have to stay in the role that was assigned to us. We get to rewrite it. We get to reclaim it. And we get to do it with evidence, with support, and with the full understanding that justice, real, lasting, documented justice, is not just possible. It is yours. So, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think about it honestly before you answer, even just to yourself. Have you ever been made to feel like your needs were less important than someone else's in your own family? Have you ever been the steady one, the one who handles it, the one who's told they don't need as much, while watching someone else receive everything you quietly deserved? Because if you have, then you already know that this story wasn't really just about me. What I went through, the betrayal, the financial crime, the sabotage, the public humiliation, the reclaiming, is more common than most people are willing to say out loud. And I think that silence is exactly what keeps it alive. So I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Have you ever experienced favoritism in your family that crossed a line? Have you ever been cheated or lied to by someone you trusted completely? And what did accountability look like for you, if you ever found it? Your story matters. Someone scrolling through these comments right now needs to read it. And if this video made you feel something, anger, recognition, relief, even just the satisfaction of watching karma arrive exactly on time, share it. Because somewhere out there is a woman sitting at a kitchen table doubting herself, wondering if she's being too sensitive, wondering if the pattern she's seeing is real. Let this be the thing that reaches her. Let this be the story that reminds her. Document everything, know your rights, and remember that the family you build can be stronger than the one you were born into. If you want more stories like this one, stories that go deeper than the surface, that talk about the real mechanics of family betrayal, financial abuse, reclaiming your dignity, and building a life that actually belongs to you, subscribe to this channel and turn on your notifications. Because we are just getting started, and what's coming next is going to hit even harder than what you just watched. You do not want to miss it.